Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Slavery at Sea, Terror, Sex, and Sickness in the Middle Passage by Sowande Mustakeem. Narrated by Mia Ellis. Introduction. Middle Passage Studies and the Birth of Slavery at Sea. In a 1734 published account, British seaman William Snelgrave detailed his experiences while employed in the African slave trade. During his stay at Jacquin, west of Benin in the Gold Coast region, a linguist brought him 2 black females for purchase, requesting that he not let them be redeemed by anyone that should offer to do it. Snelgrave obliged the proposal and inspected both women, estimating one was 50 and the other about 20 years old. Variables he used to calculate the bondwomen's ages go unrecorded, although his estimations hinged on their displayed bodies, namely their capacity for future childbearing. During initial assessments, he determined that the older female was past her labor and, as he declared, not for my purpose. He chose instead to buy the younger female, believing she offered greater long-term productive and reproductive value. Snelgrave's refusal of the older captive prompted an immediate reaction from the interpreter. It would highly oblige the king that he purchase both females, yet Snelgrave suspected that the coastal men made use of the king's name to get rid of an old woman, leading him to cease negotiations. Shortly after the failed proposition, Snelgrave gained insight into the circumstances surrounding the rejected older woman. Disappointed with the female's inability to secure a buyer, the ruler's aide ordered her to be destroyed through forcible death. The woman's hands being tied behind her and her feet across, several designated men put her into the canoe and carried her off about a half-mile from the shore. They steered into deeper waters, casting the enslaved woman overboard, after which they witnessed some voracious fishes begin to tear her to pieces in an instant. Her seaborne execution reaffirmed racial and cultural biases that Snelgrave harbored against Africans, given what he characterized as the barbarity of those people. The next day, however, he received a letter from his chief mate explaining that instead of falling victim to the jaws of traveling sharks, the woman was on board our ship. Traveling back from the coast, one of Snelgrave's officers spied something floating on the sea, alerting his attention. He perceived it to be a human body lying on its back. Seeing the mysterious individual now and then spurting water out at the mouth, realizing the person was still living, he ordered it to be taken into the boat, and out of the water beneath. Several crewmen moved the female into the dinghy, untied the rope restricting her movement, and chafed her limbs and rolled her body about until she successfully discharged a good quantity of salt water out of her mouth. The sailors, unaware of the death sentence imposed on shore, remained perplexed with how she had escaped the sharks routinely pervasive within open sea waters. The bondwoman's escape, facilitated by his own crew, forced Snelgrave to grow apprehensive if the king of Dahomey should come to know about her near-missed tragedy. He immediately ordered his first mate to charge our people to keep the thing secret. After concluding affairs on shore, Snelgrave rejoined the vessel, conducted an immediate body examination to locate any lingering injuries or ailments, and, more critically, he probed how the bondwoman became enslaved. Relying on an interpreter, he queried her relationship with the local ruler, to which she responded that she would never confess the reason of the king's displeasure against her. Soon after, the unnamed captive altered her story, declaring she knew not that she had in any respect offended him. Still unclear is whether this captive was unaware of committing any previous wrongdoing, or if her response was perhaps a protective measure used in lieu of possibly facing her accusers. The interpreter, fully cognizant of the prevailing circumstances, shared with Snelgrave that the female's removal was on account of her assisting some of the king's women in their amours. Snelgrave remained uncertain about the bondwoman's movement into slavery, yet his curiosity did not hinder him from capitalizing on her unexpected inclusion as part of the ship's cargo. The crew maintained secrecy of her stowage, confining her within the hold and forcing her to journey across the Atlantic, leaving untold the experiences she endured and bore witness to on ship. Once docked overseas, this female captive, formerly cast and treated as worthless, was sold to an acquaintance of Snelgrave in Antigua. Bartered, sold, and exiled into a foreign space, she, much like scores of other slaves, never gained an opportunity to share her personal testimony of captivity. Historical details illuminating who this victim was, her life in Africa, the experiences she endured at sea, negotiations conducted for her overseas sale, or even how and if she survived enslavement in an unfamiliar environment, are unrecorded. The fate of the younger female offered with the transported bondwoman is also obscured. What was the relationship of these two females? How long and with how many slave traders were they marketed? Did the king's aid impose the bondwoman's sentence? Or was the operation perhaps a sole endeavor instigated by the linguist? Why was her execution left to be carried out at sea as opposed to on land? Direct evidence explaining what landed either of these women into slavery, along with the range of personal sufferings they endured, is veiled. Their story, however, provides a glimpse into the unpredictable and often dangerous environments that slaves and sailors confronted. At the same time, invocation of these unnamed females, whose lives were tragically altered through the financial decisions of others, invites us to reckon more closely with complex factors of age, gender, value, and disposability of the black body amid the legal trade and traffic of people as commercial goods. Historians have long been interested in the containment of black bodies and how freedom struggles inform dynamics between slaves and slaveholders. Tracing the movement of bond people in, out, and through the watery space of the Atlantic Ocean, this book explores the social conditions and human costs embedded in the world of maritime slavery. It does not compare plantations with slave ships or attempt to suggest any spatial hierarchies of trauma. Instead, it broadens the gaze of captivity toward the interior and rather contentious seaborne spaces occupied by bond people, surgeons, and sailors. Cargo ships are not often studied as central sites of slavery. However, this book aims to show how the Middle Passage comprised a violently unregulated process, critically foundational to the institution of bondage that interlinked slaving voyages and plantation societies. A wealth of studies centered on plantations and slave communities continue to flourish in exposing the intricacies of domestic slavery across the Atlantic world. Yet, the fundamental nature of shipboard captivity and its many terrors still has not been fully interrogated. For more than a century, beginning with W.E.B. Du Bois's seminal 1896 work, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States of America, 1638 to 1870, early slave trade scholars who followed explored the social and economic histories contained in the commercial traffic of bond people out of Africa, to which Eric Williams, Walter Rodney, Lorenzo Green, Darrell Wax, Daniel Mannix, and Malcolm Cowley, among a host of other historians, collectively expanded the intellectual scope of the slave trade in profound ways. Philip D. Curtin's 1969 publication of The Atlantic Slave Trade, a Census, sparked the most momentous redirection in slave trade scholarship, relying on statistical models to quantify the movement of slaves out of Africa and into the Americas. Infamously known as the numbers game, Curtin estimated that 11 million Africans were displaced across slave societies. The number-centered methodology, while useful, comprised the most dominant approach in slave trade historiography for over 5 decades. Quantifying slaving voyages and bond people is the most primary method for accessing the slave trading past, evident in the ongoing and rather exciting expansion of the transatlantic slave trade database. In an attempt to recover the wooden world of slave ships and the personal narratives lost behind the numbers, a small yet growing body of scholarship, which I refer to as Middle Passage studies, has begun to deepen the analysis of slavery by recentering the forcible sale and oceanic transport of African captives into the New World. Therein, Middle Passage studies within this book gives birth to a world of intellectual expansion still unseen in the historiography that poses more invasive new questions to extract the deeper and more painfully violent narratives of slave trading during the legal slave trading period. Marcus Rediker and Stephanie Smallwood produced path-breaking works examining the magnitude of the Middle Passage as symbiotic to slave societies and the modern world. Rediker unravels the series of multifaceted human dramas involving crewmen, slaves, and abolitionists to argue that slaving voyages devastated the lives of purchased captives, while slave ships became the primary instrument fueling globalization and capitalism. Whereas Smallwood frames the slave trade through the intricate process of commodification into which bond people were cast on different sides of the Atlantic, astutely revealing that the most powerful instrument locking captives in as commodities for Atlantic trade was the culture of the market itself. Seeing a pressing need for a more engaged treatment of seafarers within the slaving industry, Emma Christopher chronicles the complex lives of slave ship sailors to forge much greater insight into the meanings of whiteness, power, and the fragility of their own freedom as laborers within histories and memories of the slave trade. Eric Taylor, on the other hand, traces an incredible number of ship revolts to show how these resistive measures comprised the most contentious interactions between crewmen and adult black males on slaving voyages. This book builds on the momentum of scholarship moving the Middle Passage from the periphery to consider how slavery functioned outside the locus of plantations. Looking beyond crowded cities, distant farms, murky swamps, and mountainous regions, it constructs a historical cultural womb of consciousness fueled by a commercial industry anchored on terror. Going further, it introduces the concept of slavery at sea into the lexicon of studies of slaving voyages and makes meaning of the process. Doing so, this study examines the Middle Passage, and more importantly, the social space of ships and the ocean as epicenters in the making and unmaking of transported slaves. The Atlantic slave trade and, more specifically, the oceanic transport of African captives served as the lifeline of the evolving New World economy, based largely upon the labor of enslaved populations. These variegated seaborne pathways operated as the primary isolated channel through which bond people arrived in the Americas. How do we best frame, define, and make meaning of the Middle Passage to better understand its central importance in the cycle of Atlantic slavery? Slavery at sea departs from most studies by integrating questions that probe the spectrum of human bondage through a multifocal lens extended toward sex, terror, the body, illness, and death. Delving even deeper, Middle Passage studies here interlinks the land and the sea by giving historical treatment to the scores of people directly affected by the fire of global financial interest ignited for slave labor. Left undefined and disjointed from Atlantic slave societies, the slave ship experience is remembered as a colorful mark in the triangular mapping of trade routes of goods, a chapter in history, an event, or at best, a short trip that some slaves took. We therefore know far less about what power looked like, up close and personal, amid the trade and traffic of the most highly demanded 18th century Atlantic good, African people, with considerably minimal attention to the gendered nature of this violent enterprise, as well as the deeply painful legacies of loss and degradation permanently steeped in the memories of those made slaves and carried into the Americas. Slavery is routinely understood through the prism of workplaces, fields, households, and landed sites of exploitation hinged upon the production of labor. Boundaries and the manipulation of spaces continue to generate scholarly interest. However, the Atlantic Ocean remains tangential and largely invisible to these conversations. Viewing these far-reaching oceanic bodies of water as more than highways and routes for the transport of goods, both human and material, this book widens the optic to include and recast the sea as a viable and transformative space of history. The Atlantic Ocean was more than just a space. It became an agent that imposed significant impact on people, further bridging the relationship of man and the sea. As crewmen manned ships traveling into and between distant locales, the sea became a constant zone of death. The ocean was not just where the story of slavery transpired as black bodies were ferried beyond coastal ways and into unknown lands, but as this book reveals, it also became a central conduit for how bondage unfolded and consequentially devastated lives. Slave vessels were intimately private spaces, public only to those aboard. Yet, the sea represented an important open arena of struggle for power and agency as captives jumped to their deaths and sailors flung slaves overboard knowing about, and in many respects relying upon, the presence of sharks and other dangerous sea creatures lurking beneath. Deepening our understanding of the Middle Passage as an embodied and far-reaching experience, Slavery at Sea historically traces it as a tangible experience of bond people rather than a cultural artifact of the African diaspora. The Atlantic slave trade serves as the most iconic marker of struggle, oppression, unity, strength, and perseverance in the African diaspora, but it is never thoroughly engaged for what really happened. As such, this horrific period in time continues unchallenged, untouched, and thus left as a bloodied yet sanitized chapter in global history. The Middle Passage likewise has long occupied an enduring focal point of diasporic cultural memory, evidenced by nations, poets, historians, and literary scholars who rely heavily on the symbolic nature of the slave trade as a useful departure for discussion of cultural idioms and emerging political ideologies that took shape within and beyond antebellum slavery. As such, imaginations of the slave ship experience continue to be invoked, redefined, and broadened to fit this middle ground of history, although often extending far from its conceptual origin. The pooling of distant monies for the buying and selling of black bodies set into motion an economy of violence systematically fueled through tightened entrepreneurial networks that proved enormously assistive in distribution needs. What was this system? And more germane to this study, what were the human costs and consequences of these financial decisions? To better understand the financial roots deeply tied to the massive traffic of black bodies for capital gain, the transatlantic slave trade is historically framed within this book as an industry and thus an institutional system that facilitated successful operation of the human manufacturing process. Manufacturing processes are fundamentally understood as the mass production of goods that are 1. Put together, 2. Packaged, 3. Delivered, and 4. Sold. Applying this same formulaic understanding to examination of the slave trade and its 4-century-long operation, more concretely centers how this intercontinental enterprise contributed to the construction of a black labor force and the calculated terrain of brutal experiences bond people confronted prior to their landed displacement into the Americas. This process, which every slave endured, was operationalized through woven threads of power, exploit, and deprivation maintained by slave ship workers. Therein, within the sequential process of slavery at sea, captives faced and were refined, or rather manufactured, through three key phases: warehousing, transport, and delivery. From this socio-economic lens, the movement of money, investment in ships and shipbuilding materials, wages, and other financial incentives used to entice and employ captains and crews, inland capturers, coastal traders, and surgeons served as initial down payments. Collectively, the process financed and thus sponsored a global vortex of trade and terror internationally linked between Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas, not only through its laborers, but most especially through the transport of human goods contained at its core and demanded by diverse Atlantic customers. By keeping the gaze upon merchants, investors, and currency, the many global laborers physically tasked with fulfilling these envisioned dreams of slave-trading wealth remain trivialized, along with the power these key players personally exacted in the lives of bond people. Slavery at sea centers the terrain of political struggle not only on ocean-going ships, but also on the diverse and vulnerable bodies of captives continuously unmade by their transporters and the human manufacturing process. The hostile management of slaves is regularly associated with planters, overseers, slave drivers, and patrols. However, the production of black laborers was far from a land-based phenomenon. It is not enough to say that Africans were captured, transformed into commodities, shipped out of Africa, sold to interested buyers, and turned into slaves once moved into plantations. The human manufacturing process, and more importantly, the interior holds of merchant ships served as vital sites of power sailors used to dehumanize captives, enforce dependency, inflict pain, establish authority, and prohibit any sense of control over one's personal life in the near and far future. This level of mistreatment under the guise of refinement closely mirrored the tactic of what is known to many as seasoning, a brutal, year-long, intensive process routinely understood throughout the West Indies to enforce bond people's rapid adjustment to plantation slavery. However, unbound by labor outputs and any immediate land-based laws of social order at sea, the totalizing of slavery began much earlier at the hands of slave ship workers through terror-centric means unimagined on land. Sailors relentlessly unmade bond people's bodies through physical, emotional, and psychological conditioning, making intimately clear the dynamics of power. Exploring the cyclical assaults on slaves' personhood uncovers the politics of the making and unmaking of black bodies for the first time, showing more holistically how men, women, the sick, weak, and unborn became paradigmatic to this foundational moment of conquest and debasement. This process of unmaking, which no captive was able to circumvent once forced into the slaving industry, produced a dramatic climate of terror in the world of slavery at sea that resulted in mental disorientation, familial and communal separation, malnourishment, lack of sanitation and cleanliness, severe isolation, debilitating diseases, miscarriages, sexual abuse, psychological instability, and bearing witness to physical violence committed against kin and shipmates. Equally salient to the slaving process was the refinement of manufactured slaves that it created. To be sure, testimonies that follow expose how slaves were broken and unmade through the relentless veins of violence anchored at its maritime core. Doing so lays bare the formative and permanent stripping of their freedom. Carrying these deep psychological scars on land once imported overseas, the effects of the Middle Passage filtered within and beyond the ocean, irrevocably transforming bond people's lives as well as the societies and communities into which they were imported. One cannot make sense of the behaviors widespread throughout Atlantic slave societies, reproductive agency, maroonage, resistance to familial separation, suicide, violent rebellions, or even poisoning, without examining how these insubordinate patterns took shape through early manifestation at sea. Enslaved Africans were the primary commodities of the slave trade. However, narratives of terror and strife, as well as the types of people directly and personally affected by oceanic transport, are largely unknown as intimate voices of the slave trade. This book unveils multitudes of slaves whose stories of sorrow, saga, and triumph remain untold and thus unfamiliar to many. Dramatic scenes of degradation widespread on slave ships included more victims than adult black men, typically cast as representatives of all slaves purchased and sold to foreign buyers. The counting of bodies leaves silent the deeper interrogation of how gender informed the treatment of all transported slaves. As such, the meta-narrative of black men, or rather the privileging of black masculinity within histories of the slave trade, symbolically confines black women and girls to plantations, marking slave ships as untraditional spaces where bonded females are rarely found, unexplored, forgotten, and therefore left out of the central story. Gendering the history of the slave trade solely through women's experiences still does not fully encapsulate the sufferings of the sold and unprotected. By mining the forgotten, this book reconfigures a much larger human spectrum intentionally more inclusive of girls, boys, nursing mothers, infants, teenagers, elderly males and females, the diseased, as well as disabled slaves, similarly purchased and boarded on ships alongside healthy adult males. The human stories of slavery at sea included more than just slaves, extending further to employed slave trade workers, widening the gaze to center the violent entanglement of slaves, sailors, and surgeons holistically on ships and showing more of the overlooked, forgotten, and the many unremembered whose lives help to fully humanize the histories of slavery's horrors. As slave transporters and working-class laborers of the sea, sailors served the most fundamental role in the transoceanic history of the slave trade, granting buyers access and furthering slave economies through the constant import of black bodies. Without them, the commerce of African captives and exploitation of labor-based profit could not have transpired. The grueling labor and constant exposure of mariners' own lives to the unending risks of slaving allowed for the continuation of this global enterprise. Much like plantation overseers, the contributions of sailors to slavery remains relegated within the obscured margins and footnotes of history. Therefore, I remain especially indebted to the work of Emma Christopher, Marcus Rediker, and Jeffrey Bolster for the valuable insight they provided to better explore the largely invisible world of sailors and shipping. The inner lives of seafarers are most times inaccessible due to the predominance of illiteracy, but also due to the construction of narratives that silence the labor that seamen performed in the movement and brutal management of bond people. The forced mobility of slaves is often cast and claimed as solely a part of African American history. Yet, the reliance on and allocation of terrorizing violence for the sake of economic gain spanned more than 4 centuries and included a multiplicity of nations. The stories that follow emerge from the annals of the British and American slave trade during the peak and final century of the legal slave trading period of the 18th century, making what some would cast as simply a British Atlantic story. To be sure, the transoceanic movement of slaves superseded all national and landed boundaries, marking it as a painful and rather shameful aspect.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?